Hey everyone, Dennis Chang here. Welcome to another video. So this week's video is a bit, well, it's quite tricky to talk about, and it might not be the most pleasant video to listen to if you're very, very sensitive. Maybe you don't want to watch it, but I think it's something, um, if we want to talk about it in an honest way, we have to be as truthful as possible. And certain things that I might say might be difficult to hear. So if you can't handle it, maybe you shouldn't watch it. I know that the past 2 years, 2 years and a half, have been a very difficult period for all of us. And it was a time for me to do a lot of deep thinking. I spent that time learning a lot of new things and especially working on getting better at speaking Japanese because here I am right now in Japan. I want to share my observations on learning music and on learning languages. This video is again a continuation of a series of philosophical videos on practicing that I've been doing for the past few weeks. And today's video is namely on practicing and being able to achieve certain results. Over my entire career, and especially even early on in the world of gypsy jazz, I was very, very lucky to be surrounded by really high level players. Well, the best players in the world, and lots of child prodigies. And what I did notice, I noticed a certain number of common traits among these musicians. I want to dedicate this video to a friend of mine, Brian, who actually gave me quite a lot to think about over the past few months. Brian is an American, a voice actor who has been living in Taiwan for over 2 decades. A little bit of an older fellow. So not one of those young teenage hotshots. He plays the bass. And actually one day, some months ago, he came to me looking for advice on learning to play jazz music. And he told me something that stuck with me. He told me, Dennis, I want to be that guy that people will want to call for gigs and stuff. And I especially don't want to be that guy who shows up to jam sessions and people roll their eyes. Oh, here comes Brian again. All right, play your song. Here we go. Thank you. Bye. Now, I can't say it's 100% because of me. It's not 100%. He did a lot of work. But I did share with him some of my thoughts, and I did see him practice a lot. And I can already see a huge difference in his playing. And I hope he continues this way because I think this path that I shared with him is the one that I feel will allow him to achieve his goals. I also want to dedicate this video to some of you who are of an older generation and who might have been told that it's past a certain age, it's harder to learn. I think even if there's some bit of truth in that you shouldn't let that stop you from even trying to learn. And I have some really good news for you. It is possible to learn. I really believe it. And I'll talk all about that if you keep watching this video. The thing is, when I was 16 years old, I remember I was playing with some guys. I don't know how old they were, like over 10 years older. They're probably like in mid or late 20s. And they kept telling me, oh, Dennis, you can learn so fast because you're so young. You're 16 years old. And then when I was like 25 years old, I played with musicians who were like 35, 38. Same thing. Oh, Dennis, you're still 25. You still have a lot of time. And then when I hit 30, I played with people in their 40s. Oh, but 30 is still very young. You still have a lot of time. Like when does it stop? I picked up the double bass and the violin in my mid 30s. And I started learning Japanese after that as well, 3 years ago. And now I am officially an old man. I recently just turned 40. I still managed to learn. Why is that? Because I'm very stubborn. I don't care what studies say, even if it's true. If there's something that I want, I'm going to work hard to get it. Maybe kids do learn faster than me, but I guarantee you that I'm still learning. Not only am I still learning, I managed to progress relatively quickly. So are you guys curious to know what this secret is? Maybe even bi-curious? My grandpa was bi-curious. That makes me quarter curious. So keep on watching. Okay, just before I start, I need to do the usual. I need to plug certain things. That these videos that I do, they tend to be quite long and very, very detailed. I think most of you like my videos. And if you do, you probably realize that I'm giving these videos away for free. They take a lot of time to make. This one in particular took a lot of hours just to prepare the material, to prepare what I want to say because it's such a sensitive topic. And if you enjoy what I do, liking the video, subscribing, clicking on the bell notification, sharing, commenting, all that will make a huge, huge difference, and I thank you for that. If you actually want to support me financially, you can buy some of my music on Bandcamp, or you can buy something from DC Music School. You can buy something from Soundslice, where I've done bebop lessons, gypsy jazz lessons. Check them out. The links are in the description box. And one more advertisement. I want you to watch this video.
Voilà, bonjour à tous. Alors on vous invite au stage pour la 4e édition à Samoa, au milieu de la famille Reinhardt. Bonne ambiance, au milieu des caravanes. On mange la bonne grillade. Et pas que, parce qu'il y a aussi nos amis véganes. Il y a aussi des salades et puis des bons légumes. Voilà, enfin on passe un bon moment avec Denis. On venait participer et puis à l'époque du festival Django à Samoa-sur-Seine.
For those of you who are going to the Django Festival in Samoa, please consider joining David Reinhardt's workshop. David is Django Reinhardt's grandson. And those of us who are into gypsy jazz owe quite a lot to Django and his family. Last but not least, I need to thank Stringphonic Guitars for lending me this amazing instrument. It's one of the best Stringphonics I've ever played, and I really mean this from the bottom of my heart. And guess what? It's actually for sale. So if you're interested, I can put you in contact with the company. That's being sold by the company directly. It's a used instrument, so it's actually cheaper. But what they did when they got back the instrument, they completely restored it. It looks brand new, except for a few little wear around the sound hole, because I guess the previous owner was put a pickup in the sound hole or something. But otherwise, it is an incredible guitar. Okay, I spent quite a number of hours preparing for this video because it's a very sensitive topic, and I actually need to be very, very careful with my words before someone misinterprets me and gets royally pissed off. If I do say things that are misconstrued, well, I apologize in advance, but hopefully most of you will understand the nuance of what I will be saying in this video. So I don't know who will be watching this video, but maybe I should start with a little bit of an intro to explain my background, the language and music side of things. I come from a unique background, and I think it gives me a unique perspective on learning and on practicing. And this is information that I hope to share with you to get you to reflect on such things. My ultimate goal with this video is not to piss people off, but to share information with you in an honest way, so that you can hopefully maximize your potential and be more efficient in your practice sessions. I was born in Montreal, Quebec. For those who don't know, Quebec is a province in Canada where the official language is French. And for those who don't know, Canada is a country above the United States of America. Now, the French that is spoken in Quebec is not the sacre bleu French, but it sounds more like ah ben tabarnak, c'est comme ça qu'on parle. But that said, my whole life, well, not my whole life, but my whole childhood, I went to French school, but French under the French system from France. So I grew up with both the sacre bleu and the tabarnak. My parents are from Taiwan, but interestingly enough, my father did not cross the Pacific Ocean to reach Canada, but the Atlantic Ocean. My dad actually arrived from Europe. I think he was based in Switzerland. And a friend hooked him up with a job in Montreal, teaching like French literature or something like that. And I think that's kind of amazing because French was obviously not my father's mother tongue, but he worked on it so hard that he reached a native level or almost near native level. Unfortunately, he passed away while I was fairly young, so I didn't really get to know him. I don't have many memories of him, unfortunately, because he was often away for work. He was teaching French, but after he got jobs elsewhere in Japan and in Taiwan, so I only saw him during summer vacation. What I do remember is that he read a lot of French books. He was always immersing himself in the language, in French literature, and all that. And this level of immersion is rather rare, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But my brothers and I were given French names, which is why my name is spelled with one N. In English, I go by Dennis, because if I use the French way of saying it, Denis, it sounds rather pretentious. Anyway, I think I can say that's a rather unique background. My first language was actually Taiwanese, which, to be honest, I don't speak so well. It's the language I used to communicate with my parents. My mother arrived in Quebec when she was in her late 20s with no knowledge of French, but she somehow managed to teach herself French and reach a pretty decent level, even though she's very shy about it. My level of Taiwanese is probably the equivalent of that of a 5 or 6-year-old. Quite basic and rudimentary, but functional for rudimentary day-to-day life. The problem is that in Taiwan, due to political reasons, that language isn't really used except with a much older generation. And then I went to French school for my whole life until after high school. English came from two things: TV and video games. At that time, for kids, English channels had more cartoons, so that's what I watched. But there were still some nice cartoons in French too. C'est l'histoire du petit castor, le plus petit mais le plus fort. Now, fun fact, the Quebec voice actor for Homer Simpson was a huge fan of Gypsy jazz. Unfortunately, he passed away. In high school, we had to choose between Spanish or German. I took German because my brothers also took German, and my father actually spoke some German as well. I did that for a number of years, but then it was largely forgotten or buried deep, deep into my subconscious. And because I went to school under the French system, we studied French history from France. And I distinctly remember the history classes where we talked about Eastern France, like the regions of Alsace and Lorraine. At that time, I had no idea that these regions would have a tremendous impact on my life and career, as that is where there is a high concentration of Gypsy musicians. I grew up essentially speaking 3 languages, English and French being the ones that I feel most comfortable with. A lot of people ask me what language I think in. Well, actually depends on the environment. In France, I actually tend to think a lot more in French. I tend to count in French. I don't know why, it's just the way it is. My dreams can be in English or in French, depending on what the dream is about. If I'm talking to French people, it's obviously in French. I've even had dreams in Romanesque, the Gypsy language, in Japanese and Mandarin as well. I remember this past year, at the beginning of this year, I spent quite a bit of time in France, and I started just thinking French again. So it's a matter of environment for me. Now, here's the interesting thing. The German suddenly came back to me to a certain degree because a lot of my friends are Gypsy musicians from Germany who spoke very little or no English. And they would only speak German or Romanesque to me. Romanesque, for those who don't know, is the Gypsy language. There are many dialects, but you can watch my video about Gypsy culture and all that to know more about that. But anyway, because they kept talking to me in German, a lot of vocabulary started coming back. Now, I can't say that I speak German, but I can understand it to a certain level. And some of that level is actually quite functional. I'm rather surprised. Because I spent quite a lot of time with Gypsy musicians, and a lot of them were willing to share their language with me, I started to pick up some words as well. And because this was the only language that we could communicate in, I managed to develop a decent vocabulary. This vocabulary developed naturally because this was the only language of communication between me and many of my musician friends. Here's a funny story. As I was preparing my notes for this video, and I was actually writing about this part, I got a random call from a gypsy musician, and he just started talking to me in Romanes. Since I had my iPad with me, I recorded a little bit of the conversation.
Texto, was Gili von Romani weiß. Der hat komponiert und er hat den Text gemacht auf Deutsch. Und wir wollen das alles so ein bisschen so aufbauen, weißt du?
Anthony Bauer, he will keep Moscow.
Aber genau.
Ja, Penjoles.
Ja?
Ja, penmangé doch. Basically, everything in my life that I acquired came from immersion and a need-to-know basis. Like German, the words came back to me because I was in an environment where I was forced to use it. I had to adapt to the environments. The same thing happened to me when I started going to Taiwan, where the official language is Mandarin. Now, at that time, I had zero knowledge of Mandarin because it's not a language that I grew up speaking at all. And in those days in Taiwan, the English level was very, very low, and it's actually much higher today. I had to learn Mandarin. I told myself, all right, I'm not going to enjoy this if I can't even learn some basics. So what I did, I started to adopt, an open mind towards learning the language. So without ever going to language school, I started picking up the language by ear through community and friends. I had a lot of help from my friends, so my friends and the community were my school. And now I managed to reach a fairly decent functional level, especially during the pandemic when I was stuck in Taiwan. My level skyrocketed, and now I can actually live in Taiwan. To this day, the only language that I really studied or am studying is Japanese. This is the only language, at least at this moment, where I feel I want to raise up to a certain level, hopefully close to my English or French level if it's possible. If you want to know why Japanese is so important to me, well, I can make another video about that another time. A lot of it has to do with music, but also certain life values that are very important to me. At the moment, I have 5 teachers. I take lessons practically every single day, rotating between the different teachers and sometimes having multiple teachers a day. The last time that I came back to Japan was right before the pandemic. At that time, I had only been studying it for 1 year. So communication in Japanese wasn't really possible. It's like really, really basic. During the pandemic, I worked so hard on it. And this time around, when I came a month ago, I used only Japanese. When I arrived at the airport, all the airport procedure was done in Japanese. Maybe I took out the phone to use Google Translate maybe once or twice only. I go to restaurants, I go to jam sessions, I hang out with friends, I go in the gym. I even went to get a haircut using only Japanese, like 95% of the time. The use of English is very, very minimal this time around. It's something that I'm very, very happy about. I've been purposely going out to jam sessions and going to restaurants, not for jamming or eating, but actually just to have an excuse to practice Japanese and to be able to hear it. At jam sessions, I've been meeting random people, having conversations with them, and I'm learning so much this way. It is all about immersion. I made it so that my lifestyle itself meant that I was practicing. And if you're that serious about it, then you need to put a certain level of effort into it. And this is a very important thing that I'll talk about later. It's not just about studying, it's about how you study. Because there are some people learning, I don't know, like French, but they're not getting anywhere with it. And why is that? We'll talk about that. I want to be clear about one thing. I am nowhere near being fluent in Japanese. Nowhere near it. It's an extremely difficult language. But the fact remains that despite my fairly low level, this time around, I'm using only Japanese to communicate. Because if there's some things that I don't know how to say, I find other ways to say it. And if I don't understand, I ask them to explain it in a different way. And then finally, we manage to have some level of communication. I want to talk about music now. Like many typical people learning music, I went through a lot of the same things that most people go through. I went to teachers and they taught me the typical things. They would tell me, if you want to learn jazz, you got to learn these scales, you got to learn these arpeggios, you got to practice 30 minutes of technique a day, 30 minutes of sight reading, 1 hour repertoire, a very textbook practice session. I did something like that to a certain extent. And even my youth, when I was a teenager, I did have 8 or 10 hour practice sessions fairly regularly, actually. I'd come home from school, do my homework, like very poorly, and then just practice nonstop. But let me tell you right now that doing that got me absolutely nowhere. And it's something that I actually realized early on, but I didn't understand why. Why, despite practicing 8-10 hours a day, something wasn't quite right. I put in so much work, but I couldn't really play music. I couldn't play jazz. I can nail the chord changes. In fact, I could probably pass music school exams and auditions with a fairly decent grade, but I knew deep down that I couldn't play. All this despite practicing so much. And how is this possible? It's the same with languages. You have these language proficiency exams. Like if you want to study in English speaking universities, you have to pass the English proficiency exam. And I've met many people from Asia who have passed this exam, but my goodness, they don't speak English. Some of them really can't speak English at all. The same thing with the Japanese proficiency exam. There are people who pass fairly high levels, but cannot speak Japanese to save their lives. Yet here I am in Japan using only Japanese to survive. There are people out there passing proficiency tests, but cannot function in Japanese society. Then you have me, who thus far am surviving in Japan, but unable to pass the same tests. How is that possible? Now, just as a side note, I've started recently working on being able to pass the test. So hopefully, within a few years, I should not only be able to pass the test, but also function in society. There are people studying languages, but they're not all that serious about it. And they don't progress so much and take advantage of the immersion that's available out there, especially with the technology that we have nowadays. Your 1 week a lesson with your teacher or your daily Duolingo is not enough. If you really want to progress in a language or music, you're going to do way more than that. You're going to have to find a way to be able to chat with native speakers on a regular basis. There are apps for that nowadays. You need to watch shows in that language, and maybe in the beginning with subtitles in your native language, but it's going to be all about immersion. You have to make it so that it's a natural part of your daily routine. I remember I met people learning like French at the same time as I started learning Japanese. And guess what? I've completely surpassed them because of this. They don't have the same level of seriousness as I do. I've even offered help, let's do some trade, let's exchange. And they're like, oh, I have a teacher already. Okay, fine. In the Gypsy jazz world, maybe some of you know this guy, Brad Bros, an American. I remember when he first started learning French from zero. Obviously, he was a beginner. And I remember he soon moved to France. And a year later, after living in France for a year, he was on a whole other level because he was practicing with the locals. He was trying to use whatever French he had learned and started using it right away. Now he's probably been speaking for a few years, and I would say he's reached a very, very advanced level. Your little once a week routine with your teacher or your daily routine with Duolingo is not going to cut it. If you really, really want to speak a language, immerse yourself in the culture as much as you can. What I want to say is that you are your own obstacle. Even though I have 5 Japanese teachers and I have lessons every day, it's still not enough. I'm going outside every day, talking to people, talking to strangers. I go to the convenience store, I go to the restaurant. And here, just for this video, I actually went to McDonald's for you. And I purposely said very specific things just to practice specific grammar points. Let's watch it. 皆さんおはようございます。今歌舞伎町です。ここに滞在してます。今日本語を練習しにマック行きますね。ドラえもん可愛いでしょ。歩いて1分だけかかります。あそこです。見えますか？もうすぐ着きます。ダブルチーズバーガーのセット1つと単品を1つ。サイドはポテトの M サイズ、M サイズじゃなくて L サイズ。飲み物はコーラゼロ L サイズで。店内で。はい。 that part about me telling you that you are your own biggest obstacle is true. And we're going to be talking about this thing that I call inner ear in a second. And I'm very glad that I recorded this McDonald's conversation, because because I recorded myself and I listened back, I realized where I could have done better. And I'm going to work on it. Musically, everything changed for me when I discovered Django Reinhardt, and then this so-called world of gypsy jazz, which I won't go into detail because it's a really huge topic and I've actually made videos about it, so watch those. But basically, for the first time in my musical life, when I discovered this music, there was not only a direction, but there was a very, very clear path to take. I discovered Django, and at the same time, I discovered players like Stockler Rosenberg, Jimmy Rosenberg, and Rafael Faiz. I knew right away that I wanted to play in that style. And at that time, luckily, there was actually one guy in Montreal playing that music. And he and a few of his friends played every single Sunday in a little cafe not too far from where I lived. So guess what I did? I went to see them every single Sunday for weeks and months. They were not pros, but they played the music, and that was already enough for me. I was completely new to it, so even though they weren't pros, I could learn from them. I remember going every single week, and I would ask questions like, hey, what's the name of that song? What are the chords of that song? And then I remember going to that person's house, and he would show me like his record collection. I'd be listening to the music with him, and he would be telling me stories. I learned so much this way. And I remember I would go home and learn the same songs, just the rhythm, and sometimes I'd join in on rhythm guitar. To make a long story very short, thanks to the fact that I can speak French, I managed to befriend a lot of musicians that were at the source of this gypsy jazz music. One thing led to another, and in the world of gypsy jazz today, I've worked with all the biggest names: Birelli Legrand, Stockler Rosenberg, Jimmy Rosenberg, Angelo Devar, Chavlo Schmidt, and I learned so much from all these great players, and I owe a huge chunk of my musical education to these musicians. And then as the owner of DC Music School, I got to work with a very wide variety of musicians, all of them absolutely phenomenal musicians. I got exposed to so many different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching music, but always at a very high level. I learned so much from everyone from this environment. And the gypsy jazz world has a high concentration of child prodigies. And I got to see children who are now young adults or late teenagers progress at an unbelievable rate. I started playing double bass and violin around 2017. And while I'm more at ease on the bass than on the violin, I still managed to reach a fairly decent level on both instruments. I'm telling you all this to tell you that I think I have a unique perspective on the art of practicing and the art of learning. And not only that, because even though I'm an old man now, I'm still learning a lot. And even though I'm still learning a lot, I actually always feel like a beginner. I know what many of you are actually going through. The doubts, the fears, the lack of confidence, I understand it all. Because a lot of players, when they get good, they quickly forget how hard the struggle was in the beginning. But me, because I'm always learning new things, Japanese, violin, bass, whatever, I always go through the same psychological stages. The fear, the doubt, and all that. I understand it very well. In this video, I want to share with you my experiences and how I overcame certain things, or how other advanced players got so good. It's something that I've been thinking about for years, but a lot so lately during the pandemic, because I've met people who told me they practice a lot, like many hours a day, and they would show me their practice routines. And these are people who have been doing this practice routine for years, if not decades, yet they're just okay musicians, and despite their seemingly good practice routine, at least on paper, they weren't progressing at all or barely. How is this possible? These are people who reached their plateau a long time ago. Hence the title of my video, Practicing is a Waste of Time. Then I've met people who didn't practice, well, they did practice, but not as much, nowhere near as much, but they kept growing and kept learning new things. Why is that? These are the things that I want to talk about here. Now let's get this out of the way. The talent factor. I think talent certainly exists. From having met all sorts of people, I know that it exists. Some people are extremely talented, but talent can be defined in so many ways. It's a spectrum. I talk a lot about spectrum here, and this video is all about spectrum here. I'm going to be showing you things, but keep in mind that everything will always be a spectrum, and it's up to you to choose where you want to be on the spectrum. But yes, there are different ways to define talent. I could say that some people have a talent for being super hard workers. These people who have a natural gift for learning sometimes don't even achieve a good level because of their ego. They think they're so talented that they don't need to work hard at it. Grit and perseverance. Now that's a good talent to have. Hard work still isn't enough though, because you can still be like me as a teenager who had a lot of perseverance, a lot of grit, who worked hard 8-10 hours a day, but 90% of it was a complete waste of time. And you have others who practice 1-2 hours a day who completely surpassed me. How you practice, what you practice are also incredibly important. Now I want to say something that hopefully will give you quite a lot of hope. I don't remember where I heard this, but someone actually once told me that, okay, yeah, you have people who are extremely gifted, but this gift can only be taken advantage of once you reach a certain level. Basically, if someone like Laurier like really never practiced at all, he wouldn't get anywhere. An athlete that was born with perfect genes, the potential to become the world's best athlete or whatever, the fastest run in the world, well, if that person doesn't train, doesn't work out, eats very poorly, someone like me could probably outrun that person. So no matter what, hard work and efficient work are what's most important. So let's actually talk about Laurier, who spent his entire childhood playing music and working really hard. He practiced all day and he was fully immersed in music. He's someone who was able to take advantage of his talent. But here's something about Birelli. Birelli is someone who practiced only things that he liked and that he was going to use in his day-to-day life. He does not read music. He doesn't know theory. He can't do any fingerstyle. He can't sweep pick like Frank Gambale. He doesn't tap like Greg Howe or whatever. Doesn't matter. And this is very important because Birelli is actually regarded as a very versatile musician. But the fact is, he only worked on what interested him. And luckily, he was interested in quite a lot of things. So he managed to become versatile by working on things that he loved. Not only that he loved that, but he was going to immediately incorporate into his own playing. I made a video about this, I think last year, about practicing what you like. I think I forgot what the title of the video is. Something like the best method being self-taught or something like that. But this is very, very important. I'm telling you this as someone who knows Laurier personally, as a friend. I see that he is someone who only did what he felt like doing, and then he got good at those things. He didn't waste time having this practice routine where he would do like 30 minutes of sight reading, 30 minutes of theory, 30 minutes of that blah blah. No, he only, let's say he wanted to learn this song because he wanted to play on stage. He learned the song and he learned how to play, to improvise over it, and that was his routine. There's a phrase he wants to use, he's going to work on that phrase. There's a technique he wants to use, he's going to practice that technique. But as opposed to someone saying, okay, I'm going to practice 30 minutes of alternate picking, 30 minutes of sweep picking, 30 minutes of tapping. But let's say you don't even use any tapping in your playing, and you don't use sweep picking in your playing. You're wasting your time practicing those things. At least in jazz anyway, you have to practice what you're going to use in your immediate future. Laurier is not known as a crazy sweep picker. He loves the playing of Frank Gambale, and he just barely scratched the surface on sweep picking. But I bet that if one day Birelli took an interest in really developing this sweep picking technique, he'd give Frank a run for his money. And I hope Frank doesn't watch this video. What I'm trying to say from all this is that, okay, unless you have some kind of disability, then every one of you has the potential to become, at the very least, competent and decent. I think that such goals are very achievable, and I would even dare say that such goals should be the bare minimum for anyone who aspires for a certain level of professional playing. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. Let me give you an example. Let's say bodybuilding. Maybe we can't all become Olympic athletes because some of us are not born with the ideal genes, but barring some kind of physical disability, we can all take steps to become healthier. Like when it comes to bodybuilding, they have this spectrum. I think they have these three broad categories: mesomorphs, ectomorphs, and endomorphs. Ectomorphs, that's me. That'd be someone that tends to be lean and tend to have more difficulty to gain mass compared to others. Ectomorphs tend to gain weight more easily, but have a high potential to build serious mass and power. And then you have mesomorphs, who are probably in the middle, who have this really high potential for just being athletic. So each category has its set of advantages and disadvantages. And with all that said, let's say our goal is just to be relatively fit, to go to the gym, have a little bit of muscle, decent heart rate. Well, guess what? With proper nutrition and even with minimal exercise, any one of us can be relatively healthy human beings. I personally go to the gym for general health reasons. I don't really care to be a bodybuilder. I do the relative minimum to be physically active because otherwise I spend most of my time in front of the computer or just playing guitar or studying Japanese. And I go to the gym like 4 times a week, just 20-30 minutes. And well, guess what? There was a time when I was more serious about bodybuilding. I was able to like bench press 220 pounds. That's like 100 kilos. I was able to do like 3-4 reps of 220. I can't do that anymore. I don't really care. But despite putting in just relatively minimal level effort, I can still bench press 200 pounds. So that's what, like 80 kilos or something, 90 kilos. And that's good enough for me. From a nutritional point of view, it's true that I go through phases. I should not have gone to McDonald's. But more often than not, I try to stay healthy. Now, the point is that I'm making is that as a hard gainer and someone who doesn't put so much effort, I am, for my age, quite physically healthy. And I have a good body composition. Actually, just before coming to Japan, I went on this long 3-hour bike ride, 3 or 4 hours, with a group of people. We were in our 20s and 30s, and this one guy was in his 70s, but this guy in his 70s completely destroyed us. He trains hard every single day. And that's an example of someone who pushed themselves to the limit. But I think for the average person that can make a little bit of time to be physically active, even going to the gym maybe 2 or 3 times a week, just 30 minutes, being somewhat mindful about nutrition, well, you can be fairly healthy regardless of your body composition. Again, barring some kind of disability. From a musical point of view, I think it's the same thing. You don't have to be like Bireli Legren, not at all. You can be like Brian, you can be like me and reach a decent level. Like it's the equivalent of me with the gym. I can't say that I'm buff, but actually a lot of people, especially here in Japan, they're always asking me if I work out. I do the bare minimum. That's the good news I want to share with you. With a minimal level of effort and a certain know-how, all of you can be decent. And guess what? It won't take that long. Now, of course, it depends how much effort you put into it. But if you're somewhat regular about it, within 2 years, you'll see an epic transformation. I guarantee you this. As opposed to that person, those people who practice 3 hours a day, their daily I don't want to use that word, their daily routine, but they get nowhere. That's what I wanted to say next. Why do so many people not achieve it? And this is where it gets really, really complicated. And there are a number of factors involved, actually. And this is also where my language analogies will come into play. Let me just repeat it again. One of the biggest obstacles that prevent you from progressing, well, guess what? It's you yourself. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it has to do with where you decide to set the bar. But deciding how to set the bar is not always easy because some people don't even know how to set the bar, where the bar even is. Some people don't even care to know where the bar is. There is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically means it describes people who think they are a lot better than they actually objectively are. Maybe some of you know this American sitcom. It's a show called King of the Hill. And in this show, there's a lady, Peggy Hill, who is an example of someone with a very high level of Dunning-Kruger. She thinks she speaks Spanish, but she's actually really, really, really bad at it. I've met many, many people like this in real life. And some of these people are even very highly accomplished in other fields. Dunning-Kruger is something that can affect all of us. I recognize myself of having had this effect as well in the past. It's kind of normal, but it's not good. Which is why when I gave you the examples of the number of languages that I speak, which is, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, I want to be very clear. The only 2 languages that I feel comfortable speaking are English and French. And I want to be honest with you something. My English and French levels are actually not very high. I speak street level English and French, kind of like peasants back in the day. I'm not a refined speaker. Maybe it would surprise some people to hear me say this, but I'm not actually very good at languages. I'm good at remembering things, and I'm good at adapting. When I learn languages, it always served a purpose, to communicate. There are some people who learn languages and they become very, very refined. I'm not one of those people. Because I've met people, again, they say, oh yeah, I speak Japanese. And I start speaking Japanese to them. It's like, okay, you probably did take some classes, but you don't speak Japanese. Give me a break. Dunning-Kruger. And let me remind you again, before you forget, I don't consider myself good at Japanese by any stretch of the imagination. I realize how far I still have to go. But I still managed to progress a lot. Now, beyond Dunning-Kruger, there's also the fact that some people have not developed a nuanced ear for listening to music. The ability to listen to music at a nuanced level is actually fairly complex. Now, it was actually a long time ago that I read this, and I don't remember where I read it. Maybe some of you would know. But basically, there was a study where they analyzed musicians' brainwaves or something. They noticed that the brain was more active when the participants, the musicians, were listening to the instrument that they played. So as a guitar player, if I listen to guitar music, my brain activity would be more active than if I were listening to saxophone, for example. And this is something that I realized for myself as well. In the beginning, for me, all bassists and drummers sounded the same to me. And then gradually, some people helped me to learn how to listen to the bass, for example. And I eventually learned to play the bass, and now I learned how to listen to it fairly well. I learned how to listen to the instrument at a very nuanced level. Well, not very, but fairly nuanced level. But not only that, not just the instrument itself, but I learned how to listen to stylistic interpretation. I say this because there are a lot of highly accomplished, even famous bass players out there who do not know how to play 1930s style swing bass. They can't do it to save their lives. Why is that? It's not because they're not talented. It's because they don't have the ears, the nuanced ears, to hear how it's supposed to be played. And I remember I've met like bass players who sound really, really amazing, and they're really, really good at stylistic interpretation. But then they would play an other instrument, and they'd play it so very, very, very poorly. Not because they were beginners. They actually had dexterity, but they were playing it in such a way that it just sounded horrible. It sounded off, completely not in the style at all. Why is that? Again, it's not because they're of technical ability. It's because they don't know how to listen to how that instrument is supposed to sound in that style. It's as if I went to Brazil and started telling everyone, hey man, I play bossa nova. This is how some musicians sound to me. And keep in mind, they can play other instruments and play it very, very well. But then they switch to another instrument and they play it very poorly. It's weird. But it's not weird. It's because they have not developed this nuanced way of listening. And it's the same for me. In the beginning, I didn't know how to listen to bass. I didn't know how to listen to piano. I didn't know how to listen to other instruments but the guitar. It's something you have to learn how to do. There's also learning how to listen to the instrument, also learning how to listen to how the instrument functions in a particular style. Now, I hope I don't offend anyone, but I've attended a number of traditional jazz sessions, swing jazz. And what I did notice is there are some authentic players playing, like, especially authentic sounding soloists. They play like solos in the style of the players from the 30s. But a lot of the times in these jam sessions that I've gone to, the rhythm sections don't sound quite right. It doesn't sound bad, but it doesn't sound like in the style. And what I did notice is some of these authentic sounding soloists would sometimes double on the piano or drums or bass, whatever, and it's the same phenomenon. They sound authentic as soloists, but when they play the piano or whatever, it doesn't sound quite right. Why is that? Because they have not developed the nuanced hearing that is required for that instrument playing that style. Actually, last week I went to a Gypsy Jazz session in Tokyo, and there was a young guy who played the bass, and I was very pleasantly surprised. He learned how to play in a 1930s style. It was the real deal. So that was really amazing. That is someone who learned how to listen to the nuances. But then, this thing about authenticity is a very complex topic, because how do you define what's authentic? Like, how do you even define trad jazz? What is it? Because Charlie Christian falls in the category of trad jazz for many, but so does early Louis Armstrong. And those are two completely different styles, right? Furthermore, Louis Armstrong, his style of improvisation didn't change too much, I would say. I'm not the biggest expert, but what I did notice is that recordings of Louis Armstrong from the early 30s versus recordings in the, I guess, 50s or 60s are very different. Why is that? Because of the rhythm section. In the 30s, he was playing with musicians from the 30s, so they played that way, music of that era. In the 50s and 60s, they're playing music from the era of the 30s, but this time around, Louis is playing with musicians from the newer generation who didn't really, well, I can't say they did grow up hearing it, but they weren't in it. So these are players who didn't grow up playing 1930s style, and the sound is totally different. So just, I want to be very careful with my words here. I don't want to be misinterpreted. This video is not about authenticity, because that's something that's, well, it's not stupid, but it's a bit of a necessary evil. It's only necessary when we're talking about doing something in a specific way. So the point I want to make, the ultimate point that I'm making here, is that it's about hearing something in your head, and then once you have it in your ear, you go for it. And a lot of people don't have this ear. Yeah, this thing about authenticity, it gets really, really complex, but it's a necessary evil. Let's say you say, okay, I want to play 1930s jazz, and I've seen this a lot at jam sessions. Like, hey, they pull out their charts for songs like Dinah, where it says G major 7. That's just so not in the style, and they have changes that are not in the style of the 1930s. So it does matter depending on your goals. A lot of people don't have this inner ear, even really accomplished professional musicians. It's the same thing for me when I started learning Gypsy jazz. I had no idea how to play rhythm. I had no idea how it was supposed to sound. And, well, let me just tell you right now, there's no one specific way. I made a video about this. You should watch it. But there are many sounds available. And also, let me just tell you that if your goal is to sound like the mid-1930s Hot Club of France, even a lot of top Gypsy jazz players today don't know how to play that style. It's a different sound than from what a lot of players are doing today. I can't play too loud here because the walls are thin in Tokyo apartments. So, but just watch my videos on Gypsy jazz rhythm. Actually, I want to share you a story about rhythm guitar. When I went to see Fabi Laferta for a whole month, I think it was September of 2003 or 2004. I don't remember. Spent a whole month in the south of the Netherlands, in Belgium, northern Belgium. I went to see Fabi regularly, and we worked a lot on rhythm guitar. And I showed him what I had learned, and he says, it doesn't sound right to my ears. and he would show me, but I couldn't hear the difference between what he was doing, what I was doing. This is like the era before smartphones where we could record lessons easily. So all I could do was just trust him. He would just show me for like a whole month trying to get this sound, and I couldn't get it. I remember practicing all day, every single day, feeling a little bit discouraged, to be honest, because how can I achieve something that I can't even hear for myself? And towards the end of my stay in Europe, I showed up to his house. I played rhythm for him, and he said, "Perfect." To this day, I have no idea what was different, but he said it was perfect. I was super happy, but like I was so perplexed and confused, and actually a little bit nervous because okay, that was the end of my stay in Europe. What if I go back home and I can't reproduce this sound? And I remember I contacted him, hey, like a year later, like, hey, can I come back and to see you, to show you this rhythm, to see if I'm doing it well? All right, he said, yeah, sure. So I go over to his place, I play for him, says, yeah, perfect, sounds the same. So now I have no idea what was different. I shared this story with Fapi's nephew, Charles Limburger, well, distant nephew or something. And I told him this story. And then I played that rhythm for him. And for those of you who don't know, Charles Limburger is blind. And he told me something very interesting. It's that if I didn't know that you were Dennis Chang, I would have thought it was Fabi Lafertin playing rhythm. So this story I want to share it with you because, okay, at that time, still today, I don't know what was there. I had no idea how I sound before I was doing it correctly versus how I'm doing it now. But basically, Fabi Lafertin helped me to develop the ear for it. Now I know, well, I don't know what I was doing before, but I know what I'm doing now. I can hear the sound in my ear, my inner ear. This is a case of me not knowing something and seeking external help, someone that I trusted to help me to hear. These days, for gypsy jazz, swing music, and I'd say even bebop, I've developed a very nuanced ear to know how each instrument, or most instruments, should generally be sounding, depending on the certain specific sounds that we're going for. And especially so for guitar and bass. For other instruments, at least enough to know what sounds in the style. Now, of course, if you don't care to sound in a particular style, it's fine. You do whatever you want. But I want to be clear here. I'm not here to talk about, I'm not here to dictate how things should sound, because that, again, all depends on your inner ear. This is what I'm talking about. It's about this inner ear. But since we're talking about like trad jazz or certain styles that exist in the past, then generally, I think most people would agree there needs to be a certain level of respect as to how it was played. I don't think it has to be 100% exactly the same way, because I don't think it could ever be 100% the same way due to the fact that that's something in the past. In those days, that was the trend. Now we're in the future trying to recreate a trend of the past. But the fact that we are in the future, not in the past, it will never 100% be the same. Or for example, one of the stereotypes nowadays for gypsy jazz is like, you got to own one of these guitars if you want to sound correct. That's not true, because there are people who own guitars like this who to my ears don't sound correct. And before the 2000s, when these guitars were mass produced, these instruments were hard to come by, and a lot of gypsy musicians played on just random guitars, some on electric guitars, solid body guitars. Even Stokelo Rosenberg, when he was growing up, he had like a cheap solid body guitar. And let me tell you, those people play way more authentic than some people who own these fancy guitars but can't play. So what I'm saying is that to play in the style, I think there's a degree of flexibility in there. I've developed my ears to be able to hear very specific things for very specific instruments, very specific styles, very specific sounds. But there are a lot of things I don't know how to listen to. Like, I have a good friend of mine who apparently is quite renowned in the traditional, I guess, fiddle world, like Irish, Celtic, Scottish, Quebecois. He plays with a lot of big names and is often hired to teach it. And he plays in all the major festivals in the world. And we were hanging out one time, and he was explaining to me all the different styles. Like, oh, in Quebec, they would play this melody like this. In Ireland, this Western Ireland, Northern Ireland, or whatever. In Scotland, they played it like this. My mind was completely blown. Like, he could just listen to a recording. It's like, oh, this person probably learned from this region, blah, blah, blah. I can't tell. So it's very, very fascinating. This nuanced hearing is incredibly important if your goal is to have a specific sound. Your inner ear needs to hear this specific sound before you can reproduce it. unless you're very lucky, which actually some people are. Some people have no idea that they sound good. I know it sounds weird, but just bear with me. Or more, that they just naturally play the way they do, and it happens to be the correct way to play it, depending on the sound you're going for, of course. Maybe we can call these people naturally gifted. And actually, a lot of prodigies have this quality, like Birel Lagren. Like, never really worked with a metronome, but his sense of time is so like precise, and it's so authentic. When he plays gypsy jazz, he mimics the time feel of Django Reinhardt, but when he plays bebop, it's a completely different time feel. Same thing with George Benson. When George Benson is playing bebop, uh, he has a specific time feel, but when he starts playing the pop stuff that he does, it's a different kind of time feel. I don't know George Benson's like practice reading was here, but I don't think he was the kind of guy who like worked on specific timing exercises with the metronome. He just feels it that way. Remember, like this talent thing is a spectrum. The ability to hear that your intonation is good, the ability to hear that your rhythm is good, the natural ability to hear how to understand how melodies relate to chords, etc. Some people have all of the above, some have a few. Birelli is probably one of those guys who has like all of the above. There are people who don't know that they sound good and therefore couldn't really explain things, like Birelli Legren, but they just naturally are doing things the right way. That's why they're not always great teachers. Others will have to find out somehow how to hear such things. And when they hear such things, they'll have to work to correct their playing so that it matches what they hear. You'll have to do a lot of thinking, and you may need help. For example, me learning to hear the bass, piano, drums, violin, sax, like in the swing styles, that took me a lot of time, quite a number of years. And some people did teach me how to listen to certain things, how to listen to certain details. It took a lot of deep reflection as well. And even then, I'm only able to give very clear directions if it's like bass, guitar, or violin. Because these are the instruments that I know how to play, so I can give directions. Like, I remember there was a bass player doing something with 2 fingers, and the sound was different. And I suggested maybe that they use only 1 finger so they get the same sound. And then boom, just doing that, they got the sound that I was looking for. For piano or drums, I wouldn't know what to say. For me, rhythm was extremely difficult. For Birelli, it was so easy. He just felt rhythm naturally in the correct way. And I remember as a soloist, I used to rush significantly, which is actually quite common in gypsy jazz. But not only did I rush a lot, but my time feel used to be really, really shaky. And people constantly pointed it out to me. And it was very difficult to hear this, like this such criticism. And, while I'm still not satisfied with my time feel because it's really my biggest weakness, it's actually a whole lot better. Because why? I made a choice to trust the people who told me that my time feel sucked, and I acknowledged the feedback, and I did something about it. It's still something that I work on. It's still something I think about. It's probably the thing that I think about the most. Last year, I remember I did this little gig at a small festival. This bass player never really played the style, and the person was completely messing up the groove. Not because they weren't talented, because they just didn't know like how the groove was supposed to sound. And I noticed certain things about the way they were playing, and I told them to change one little thing, and suddenly they nailed the groove. Everyone else on the bandstand noticed the same thing. They were like, "Wow, it's a miracle." That's what I mean. I know how to listen to bass. I can give very clear directions. Because it's a wide spectrum, it can be very complex. It can be as simple as just changing one little thing, as is the case with the bass player, but in my case, it can be months or a few years working very, very, very hard to change the habits. Like this rhythm thing, this time feel thing is something that I struggled a lot with. I really had to do a lot of thinking, a lot of I don't know if I should say this word, conversion therapy. So how did I learn to listen? Well, actually, I'm still learning how to listen, to be honest, and I'm often discovering new nuances that help me a lot and also help me in helping others. But the biggest thing that helped me was that I have a very, very open mind, and I'm very receptive to criticism and feedback, and especially from people that I admire. And even still today, like I said, Birelli, Charlenberger, Stokkel Rosenberg, Angela Bar, all these players, being with them, playing with them, helped me so much. And I got exposed to so many different approaches, so many different points of view, so many ways of thinking. I'm very, very thankful that they were willing to tell me what they wanted from me as a rhythm player. If you can find people that you really admire to give you the kind of feedback that I was able to receive, then that will help you develop this inner ear. But let me tell you, some people will not tell you because they don't want to hurt you. I was in a situation with a very famous musician. Well, not very famous, but famous enough anyway. We were working with a pickup group, and this person kept pointing out things that I should be doing, like giving me like harsh, strict instructions. The other musician was doing way worse than me, but this famous musician didn't say anything to the other musician, only to me. To be honest, I was really, really pissed off. Like this hypocrisy really upset me, but I just kept it inside. But then after, this famous musician told me that in the future they didn't want to play with this other musician anymore because they knew that that person was not receptive to feedback and therefore would never hear what was wrong. And that's a very powerful thing. I got my butt kicked by the famous musician, but the other person didn't. But in the future, I still get to play with this musician. How did this famous musician know that this other person wasn't receptive to feedback? It's an ego thing. Sometimes when you get to play with famous musicians, especially a few, like, okay, I got to work with a lot of famous musicians. Sometimes they directly ask for me, but sometimes it's a political thing. Like people hooked me up, and just because I was able to play with X famous musician doesn't mean that they enjoyed playing with me. Hopefully they do. I don't know, but I'm always happy when they give me feedback, though. But some people get to play with famous musicians but never get any feedback. So then they guess, oh, I played with so and so, so I'm this good. And when you have this ego, some musicians they can see, all right, this someone that's not receptive to criticism. And that's a very powerful thing to think about. Because I remember with this famous musician, they would tell me what I was doing wrong, what I should have. Then I would okay. I was like, all right, can I take a 10-minute break? I'm gonna go in the practice room. I'm gonna practice. I'm gonna shed this thing. I turn on the metronome. I practice whatever I had to practice, and I show, hey, I got it. And the music was like, great, wonderful, and so on. It would went like I would go and practice and fix whatever needed to be fixed. And I guess this famous musician saw that I was hardworking and I was willing to hear what they had to say. And a lot of people, they say, oh, I'm not good enough, sorry, I apologize. Yeah, okay, maybe you apologize, but don't apologize. You're not good enough? Well, then, you know what? Do something about it. If you want to play with this the famous musician, like super good musician, and you're not at the level, guess what? Work on it. Let me tell you something, good news, that we are hired in the capacity of accompanists. Now, accompaniment is not easy. There's an art to it, but compared to being a world-class soloist, it's way easier. And here's the good news. We all have the ability to be decent. And to be a good accompanist doesn't take the kind of effort it takes, in my opinion, to be a world-class soloist. I'm not saying that I'm a good accompanist because I actually know what I'm good at and what I'm not as good at. But I'm also still learning. I'm always receptive to new feedback because I realize that there's so many ways to accompany, and the only way to get good at it is when you play with someone that you respect. You have to be willing to accept their feedback because the different musicians want different things. When I accompany Charlenberger, I have a specific way to accompany. If I accompany Birey Legrand, it's going to be another specific way. I'm still learning. With Angela Bar, it's a completely different it's another way. Think about that. How powerful is that? At the beginning of this video, I told you about Brian. What he told me resonated with me so much because I was the same. one of the things that was important to me early on is that I wanted to respect, not I didn't want to respect, I wanted to earn the respect of people that I admired the most. I remember I was always thinking the way I played, if I played this way in front of Django or in front of Birelli, what would they think? What would Jesus do? And to do this, to earn their respect, I had to be willing to accept all levels of feedback. And still today, while I do have a high level of confidence in my ability as an accompanist, I'm still very, very open-minded and very receptive to what people expect of me, especially the players that I admire that I'm working with. Because, like I said, having worked with so many high-level players, there are so many approaches that at one point, it is no longer objective. And to be able to accompany someone, you have to understand what they expect of you. For example, with Angelo DeBar, I know that I have to push really hard on the rhythm. It speeds up. With Birelli, it's the same, but maybe not as much. With Cha, it's the other way around. He doesn't like it when it pushes too hard. So that's what I mean when it's not objective. Because if you ask me to play with a metronome, which is something I did a lot, I can nail it fairly well. But this goes far beyond just using the metronome. And this thing about feedback, it's the same with me. Unless people show to me that they're very sincere about learning, or they specifically tell me that they want very honest feedback, I actually don't go around telling people how they should play. Because, like I said, how you should play is entirely up to you. You choose for yourself. Also, generally these days, I mainly play music for fun, so I don't really care so much about the finer details of how others are playing. Now, if I'm the leader of a very serious project, that's where I'm going to be very specific as to how I want the music to sound. And actually, I don't like being a leader. It's not something I do often. But to this day, I can only think of two people with whom I could be very, very honest with feedback. Those are my buddies, Will Dickerson and Zach Martel. Those are the two guys that I've met in my entire life, so far anyway, that I see are serious enough that I can be very open with them. And recently there was a guy in the south of Taiwan, a guitar player, like I said, okay, that I could see was very serious about being good. There was a bass player as well. These people are very rare because a lot of people, again, they have a certain level of ego, and that's a huge obstacle. I know a lot of these people that I work with, I know that I was very, very, very strict with them. And sometimes I do feel bad about being that strict. I was never mean, but like when I start to hear something, a very specific thing, I'm going to tell that person, no, it's not like that. No, no, no. You're going to be hearing a lot of no from me. Kind of like when I was with Fappy. No, 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 until one day, yes. And with these people, it's the same. No, 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 until one day it was yes. And these people have told me, they've thanked me for it. Like, like they can hear it now. And they're very thankful that I gave them this very honest feedback. But not everyone is receptive to it. My experience tells me that most people are just not willing to hear such feedback. I know this now because I didn't know that when I was younger, and I've pissed off a number of people for telling the truth. And here's some funny thing. There are some people who know how to listen to other people's flaws but cannot hear their own flaws. That exists too. And I understand this perfectly. It's not pleasant. Even today, I get feedback from people, and it's not pleasant to be on the receiving end. But in the end, especially if it's coming from someone that I highly respect and admire, then I'm very, very appreciative. I have a friend in Japan, an American guy, who corrects my Japanese all the time. It's not pleasant to hear that. Like, oh, I made a mistake. But you know what? I'm glad that they told me, because then at least now I know where I made the mistake. Even last week at a jam session, a player complained that I didn't take the tempo that the soloist asked for. And which, to be honest, it could have been true. I might have done the intro at a different tempo. So this person could hear where I did wrong, but I always wondered if this person themselves knew that when they played ballads, they kept slowing down. I've never told them. I'm just not going to tell them. Because this is a person that has a very intelligent, very talented person, plays with a lot of good players. So maybe they don't want to hear what I would say. Otherwise, really though, music for me is just for fun. People play however they want. I don't really care. I'm hardest with myself first and foremost before I'm going to be hard with anyone else. The thing is, when you start to play a lot of gigs and you become one of the top dogs in your city, your country, or whatever, you tend to develop a little bit of an ego, and it's normal. And that is really where things can get in the way of being able to progress, especially if you cannot hear the nuances that I'm talking about. And for me, my goals have always been to earn the respect of the people that I admire the most. And I'm always thinking, when I play, I'm always thinking about what my favorite players would think of my playing. And so far, they've always been willing to tell me directly what they wanted out of me, and for that, I'm so grateful. It was not pleasant to hear some of the feedback that I got. I'm be very honest with you, but I'm incredibly grateful. I've set the bar very high for myself as an accompanist. And this is where I want to talk about the language analogy. Let me be clear again, I'm still very much a beginner in Japanese. I feel like I'm only beginning to scratch the surface. And of course, 2 full years have passed since the last time I came to Japan, where at that time I couldn't communicate in Japanese at all. And this time, where practically all communication is done in Japanese. But how did I practice Japanese to get to this level? Okay, I have 5 teachers now, but in the past year, it was more like 3 or 4 teachers, and we had daily lessons. So that obviously helped. And at that time, I was trapped in Taiwan. I wasn't in Japan. But again, having the lessons help, but some people study daily to be able to take exams, but still can't speak whatever language they're studying. And this is where it helps out. The different teachers I have their own different teaching styles. Some don't have any teaching style, and I just chat with them about random things. So there's already a focus on conversation. And one of the most important things is that I told my teachers to not only be very free in correcting me at any time, but that even though we had daily lessons, I was totally okay to repeat the same material for weeks, for days, for months even. Sometimes we repeat the same class, the same material for like 15 days or 2 weeks. And then like a month or two passed by, and then I'd say, hey, can we repeat that class we did like a few months ago? Let's do the same thing again until it really sticks in your head. This is very important because just like developing certain musical abilities, when it comes to languages, you need a lot of repetition for things to stick. You'll be learning so much and you'll be forgetting so much, but through not endless, but constant repetition, things eventually begin to stick. And I remember there are certain words in Japanese that took a year, 2 years, and now even 3 years before I started to remember what those words were. But it's through this constant repetition that I managed to build my current vocabulary. Constant repetition, practicing, and just practicing out loud the pronunciation and all that. The part where I told my teachers to correct me if I ever made a mistake is especially important. And this is where actually a lot of my teachers told me that they didn't really always want to constantly correct me, because then they would be afraid that the students would feel discouraged. And it's true, I agree with them. A lot of people would, but it was a very hard pill to swallow. But I told them, listen, it's okay. I know it's not pleasant to be corrected all the time, but I want this badly enough that I want you to correct me all the time and anytime. It's not easy at all. I know, like, it's really hard, but you have to get over it. If you're really serious about wanting to get something, you absolutely need to get over this fear of making mistakes, this fear of being corrected. And here's the thing, you might make the same mistakes all the time for weeks, if not months, before you eventually fix it. That's the same for me with Japanese. I made a lot of it, and the same for me with even certain things on the guitar. In music, I made a lot of mistakes, but I was always I learned actually to remind myself where I messed up. Yeah, I tell the same thing to even my Japanese friends. Please correct me if I make a mistake, because I can't fix what I don't know needs to be fixed. And if I constantly make the same mistake because I forgot or I'm not aware, I apologize, but please keep correcting me until one day I stop making that mistake. I want to share a story about how I got very interested in accompaniment. I think it was the summer of 2005. I developed a very crazy obsession with rhythm guitar and time feel. Ritari was one of my first mentors, a French Gypsy guitar player. That in the summer of 2005, he had a tour in France. His regular rhythm guitar player couldn't do it, and he knew that I was a huge fan of his. So he invited me to be the rhythm player, and I was so happy. but I didn't do well. Apparently, I had the sound, but I kept slowing down. I was not together with the bass player. And those guys gave me tons of like feedback. It constantly reminded me every time I was doing wrong, and I could see in their expression how frustrated they were. It was not pleasant. It got better towards the end though. They kept telling me that I was slowing down, but at that time I couldn't hear that I was slowing down. How can I fix it if I can't even hear it? But okay, that what I did tell myself, like I told myself, okay, force myself to play faster than I want to. And when I did that, apparently they were more satisfied. Towards the end of the tour, they were saying, "Hey, you did a good job." They were okay. And then just a week later, I went to the Netherlands and I met up with Paulus Schaefer, one of the most famous gypsy jazz players in the world, and we jammed. And we were playing a song. First, he did a solo. I played rhythm for him. Then it was my turn to solo, and I told him, "Whoa, it's way too fast." And he told me, "You know why? Because you sped up like crazy." So a week before I was slowing down like crazy. A week later I was speeding up like crazy. And this got me so obsessed with time feel as an accompanist that I started working on it. And then I was very lucky that I got to work with people like Vava Adler, Chad Lindbergh, all these different players who gave me different tips and different ideas on how to think about time feel, because everyone wants something different. The point of this story is to tell you that if you don't know what's wrong, you can't fix it. In this case, I had no idea I was slowing down. And then a week later, I had no idea I was speeding up. I'm glad that they told me. And then I started thinking a lot about it. And then I worked with more and more musicians. I worked with metronome. I did this and that. And it's a whole lot better today. But it's still a work in progress because we are not metronomes. We are not robots. We move in one way or another. And when I meet new musicians, like high level players that I work with, I'll always be receptive to what they expect of me. And here's another thing, depending on the style of music, in this case, let's say you're a jazz musician, beyond practicing whatever you need to practice at home, what will help tremendously is working with musicians who are significantly better than you, and musicians that have a very clear vision of what they want out of the music. And the more musicians like this you can work with, the better it will be. Many musicians like that, they're all going to be your teachers because you're going to be exposed to different ways of thinking. You'll have different ways of approaching things, and you learn how to adapt. So maybe instead of taking lessons, you should ask a really good player that you admire if you can pay them to accompany them. And if you show that you're working harder, maybe they'll hire you to be their accompanist. Maybe it can be an apprenticeship. In the beginning, you're the rhythm player, your accompanist or whatever, and you don't take any money in the beginning, and they'll show you what they know. I've actually seen this scenario before. Complete beginners that complaining that actually they're playing gigs with players that they admire, but they're not getting paid. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. They're complete beginners. The person that they're accompanying is teaching them these nuances, and they're expecting to get paid. Imagine if Birelli were willing to hire someone who's not very good, but I don't know, Birelli likes this person and wants to help this person, and they're not going to pay you for the gigs, but they're going to teach you. It's like, well, no, I need a minimum of this much money. It would be a different story if the person Birelli were hiring were an established pro. But here we're talking about mentorship. It's ridiculous to even think about money. Now, of course, Birelli has high-paying gigs, and he's not likely to hire an amateur. But that's just that's just an example. And because he gets good gigs, even if he were to hire an amateur, maybe he should probably pay a little something, but definitely not the full market rate. There's this story about Larry Coryell that he said when he was young, he grew up in a place where there wasn't really a jazz environment, but he was studying jazz like at a school or something, and he did everything that the school taught him to do, and he thought he was good until one day he went to a town where there was an actual jazz scene. He went to the jam session and got completely humiliated. And this other guitar player walked up to him and said, "Hey, you're not good," something like that, "but I see potential in you. Why don't you come over to my place and let's jam? You just play rhythm for me," something like that. And Larry agreed. So they hung out a lot, and that's where Larry developed the most, according to him. Yes, finding someone who has a clear vision about music, and then having them mentor you, that's one of the best education you can ever receive. Community immersion is very, very important. I wouldn't say that it's critical, but it makes a huge difference to be in an environment like that. There's a reason why there's a high concentration of high-level classical Indian musicians in India, why there's a high concentration of high-level, let's say, shamisen players in Japan, it's a Japanese instrument, modern jazz in New York, gypsy jazz in Paris, etc. Because you have this community where such things are happening. It's not where you just have one teacher or one mentor. The entire community is your mentor. And the bigger the community, the more likely, the higher the standard. I think, for example, in Tokyo, it's very impressive that Tokyo has a trad jazz scene. And like I said, there are a lot of high-level soloists who sound in the style, but so far, I haven't seen everyone, but I have still not found people who play the rhythm section parts the way I expect to hear such parts. That's because even though Tokyo has a trad jazz scene, it's still a niche scene with fewer players than, let's say, the modern jazz scene. But it made me think about the following. Even in Paris for gypsy jazz, like one of the capitals of gypsy jazz, or New York for contemporary jazz, you have tons and tons and tons of musicians. But of course, not all are great musicians. Not all are at the top level. Maybe just a small percentage. But because it's the hub for that music, even if it's a small percentage, it ends up being quite a decent amount of musicians. I don't know, maybe like 20% are bad, 40% are okay, decent enough. Maybe 20% are good, and maybe like 15% are incredible, and maybe 5% are like at the top of the food chain. And let me just tell you that these are figures that I pulled out of my whoop whoop. But basically, just because you go to India to learn Indian classical music doesn't mean that the random person that you find off the street is a high-level musician. The fact that India is the world center for Indian classical music just means that it has a very healthy scene for the style, and you'll be able to find players at every single level, but you still have to look for the ones that are at a high level. If, for example, you have 500 gypsy jazz players in Paris, and I doubt those are the actual figures, but that means that 200 are decent, they do the job, 100 of them are quite bad, maybe another 100 are quite good, 75 are incredible, and 25 of them might be superstars. So those figures are totally inaccurate. But let's just say something like that. But now let's say there are 40 gypsy jazz players in some city, which is actually not such a bad figure. But you see, it's significantly less. That means 8 of them are terrible. 8 of them are good, 16 of them will do the job, and you're probably not likely to meet the incredible ones. And this is the reason why some people choose to move somewhere for music, if they're so serious about it and passionate about it. But again, moving somewhere doesn't change how you play. While the environment can greatly help you, your own open-mindedness to feedback and change is what will allow you to progress. And whose feedback are you trying to get anyway? I'm so lucky that I got feedback from the players that I admired the most. And when you receive the feedback, are you willing to accept that you may potentially need constant reminders and you need to work hard to be able to overcome certain weaknesses? At music camps where I've taught, I've met people who show me their practice routine, and I heard them practice. Like I remember this one time I heard this person do their daily metronome routine, something that they're really, really proud of. And in theory, it's a good routine, but I could tell they were never ever going to improve. And why is that? Because they have not developed the nuanced ear to hear that they're doing their exercise completely wrong. What point is there to play with a metronome if you cannot even hear that you're completely out of time? What point is there to practice violin scales if you cannot hear that you're completely out of tune? This is where the nuance hearing becomes so important. Because they cannot hear it, that means they will need someone to hear for them and work with them until they can hear it. That's my Fappy story about the rhythm. I couldn't hear that I wasn't doing it the way he wanted it to be until one day he said, we worked hard together, and then he said one day, you got it. I've met people who told me their goal is to develop their technique, and they have this daily practice routine, like 30 minutes of technique a day for like 20, 30 years. And their technique is usually decent, but I can tell right away that their technique will never improve based on their practice routine. And why is that? If you practice something like this, a scale like this, maybe you'll get good at playing this scale with a decent sound at this tempo that I'm playing at. But if your goal, well, here's the thing. They said they practice their technique, but what does technique mean for them? Is it speed? Is it sound? Is it time feel? It can be any of the above. But if it's to play faster, well, I can say that this is not an ideal fingering. And if I see that they're using inefficient mechanics, you'll only get so far. So you have to understand the purpose of why you're practicing technique. So let's say it's for being able to play fast, then you need to find efficient fingering and efficient mechanics. And then you need to practice. It's a little bit late at night here, so I can't really be playing guitar. If you can't answer the questions about why you're practicing technique, like very specifically, then I think that routine is useless, in my opinion. You can practice it for 20, 30 years, and I've seen people do that. Well, maybe not for 10, but for a long time, for years, and they don't achieve any results. So practicing is a waste of time. You might as well spend that time doing something else. The goal is always important. If you just say general technique, then you're wasting your time practicing your Kreuzeritudes, your Bach partitas on the guitar and all that. Unless, of course, you want to play those specific pieces. I'm using those examples. A lot of guitar players practice such things, but they don't know why they practice them. It's one thing to practice those pieces for the sake of performing them, but it's another thing to say you practice them for technique. But if your goal is to play like hot bebop lines at a certain tempo, then those Bach partitas, those Kreuzeritudes are useless. You need to be practicing bop lines. And then you got to find the right fingerings, the best tone, the best mechanics to be able to achieve that goal. You would study like Bach partitas or sonatas for other reasons, maybe for counterpoint ideas, or you like the piece and that's fine. Like I said, you have specific goals. The key here is your end game. It doesn't matter what you practice as long as there is a need to practice it. In other words, what you practice needs to match your goals. Otherwise, I think it's useless. But here's another thing. Some people just practice for the love of being able to play an instrument. It's almost like therapy to them, like meditation. In which case, yes, play whatever you want, have fun, whether you get good or not, it doesn't matter. The therapeutic aspect is a very, very valid reason to just touch an instrument. Whether such practice sessions will yield results it doesn't matter. I certainly know people like that, and that's totally fine. If that brings you joy, go for it. But we're not talking about that here. We're talking about specific goals, about really seeing visible progress. And I remind you that story of when I was a kid practicing 8-10 hours a day. I don't even remember what my routine was, to be honest. I remember that there was this thing on the internet that actually was so well written, like how to develop monster technique, and it was like the permutations of this 1, 2, 3, 4. You had like 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 4, 3, then you have like all the permutations, like what else? I do remember practicing maybe like a few hours of that every day. Like they would tell me, practice this for 20 minutes, 20 minutes, and through all the permutations, it would take maybe a few hours. And I did do that. But when are you ever going to use this permutation? Or, let's see. When are you ever going to use that? The article looks so legit, man. But I practiced. I was a gullible kid. Like 1 hour of chord theory practice, 1 hour arpeggios, 1 hour scales, 1 hour side reading, 3 hours singing, 2 hours of improv, whatever. Like, it's just like such a generic thing, but it's a waste of time if there's no end game. And this is why some people can accomplish far more with just a few hours than people who practice 8 hours a day, because the 8 hours is nonsense. When I started to really progress is when I started to learn Gypsy jazz, because then there were specific goals. One, I wanted to play with people. And then I went to see my friend play all the time, and I learned all the songs that they played. And then I started jamming with them. And on songs that were difficult to improvise over, I would start to study what my favorite players were doing over such songs, and then I came up with my own ideas. Rinse and repeat. By the way, my sight reading skills are not that great, but by guitar player standards, actually, they're very, very good. My general reading skills are actually quite good by guitar standards, but I've never practiced sight reading. How did I get good at it? It's because for many years, when I was doing transcriptions, professional transcriptions for DC Music School, I was working with notation software for many hours on a daily basis. So I developed this skill naturally as a result of my natural daily routine, my work. I remember at that time there were some people who were going to music school doing their masters, and sometimes they'd come over and we'd practice sight reading together, and most of the time I outread them. These are people who practiced it, and me who never practiced could read better than them. And this is because these are people who put maybe 20 minutes a day or 10 minutes a day into practicing sight reading, but they have no use in their daily life. Me, I was practicing sight reading, well, not sight reading, but reading for many hours a day because it was part of my work. It was part of my life. So you see a pattern here. Everything is goal oriented and is less about practicing than finding about a specific lifestyle where practicing is naturally infused into the lifestyle as much as possible. So like I said, so my example with the reading thing, I practiced reading many hours a day without realizing I was practicing it. Of course, you can have dedicated practice sessions, but if you adopt this natural lifestyle, then you don't necessarily need to be doing 10 hours because you'll be doing those hours automatically as part of the natural lifestyle. Let me give you an example. A lot of people ask me about my technique, and I made some videos about it, so just watch them. But a lot of people are surprised when I say I don't work on technique. I rarely worked on technique. I don't say this to show off, not at all. I actually just watch my videos, but basically when I worked on being able to play what I wanted to play, and what I wanted to play were certain phrases, and then I would practice them, just be able to use them without having to think too much about them. And then at gigs and jam sessions, I would use them all the time, and that's where my technique came from. Because there was a time when I was playing a lot of gigs, and I would use those phrases all the time at different tempos. My technique grew from that naturally. Of course, you still have to pay attention to efficiency and all that stuff, but just watch my technique video. Everything that I do in recent years is based on a certain logic. That's how a lot of prodigies progress so fast. And it's quite possible that many of them don't know that they're being logical in their way of practicing because they just naturally adopted this lifestyle that is conducive to rapid progression. Birelli, when he was a kid, because his family played music and he wanted to play with his brother, he learned a lot of songs and they played together all the time. Then he'd spend hours figuring out what Django did over certain chord progressions, and then he'd reproduce them in his improvisations. The first song that Andreas Ferrari learned when he was a little kid was Blue Bossa. He learned the melody, then the chords, then he listened to a lot of records, and then he started to hear naturally what he heard on records worked, like how the melodies related to the chord progression, and then he started just improvising really without knowing anything about scales or arpeggio or anything. He just knew that over this chord you can do etc. And many of these goals are short-term goals that work towards achieving certain long-term goals. Like if you learn 20 songs by heart and you play them every day for a year or two, well, those songs and those chord progressions, you start to hear them in your head. They'll be part of you, and you won't even know how to explain it, but it's something that you just feel. And then one day you hear a new song that has a similar chord progression. Well, it'll be very easy to absorb because you already have it in your ear. And so basically learning each song builds towards this long-term goal of being able to learn faster and faster and faster, where then it's no longer difficult to have 100 songs in your head, not because you know each individual chord symbols or melody, but just because you hear them in your head. And it's very hard to explain. Those of you who understand what I mean, you understand. And until you do this work, you'll see what I mean. Language is the same. Instead of learning songs, you learn certain vocabulary to use for certain situations. Like with one of my teachers, I spent weeks repeating variations on the same topic. Like I remember some of the topics were going to the convenience store, going to the gym, going to get a haircut, buying clothes, going to the restaurant. All these little variations. And just like all these different situations, they're like different songs, but there you will still find similar patterns. For example, if you go to a restaurant and you have to wait 90 minutes, you can say, "Ah, すみません, 時間にします," which means, "Ah, sorry, I'm not gonna wait 90 minutes. I'll come back next time." But if you go to buy clothes and then you try some clothes and you don't want to buy them after all, you can use the same lick. すみません, 次回にします. Let's say you want to try clothes. So you go to the person in the fitting room. すみません, 試着してもいいですか? Guess what? If you go to the guitar store, you can use the same phrase to try instruments. I take the subway almost every day in Tokyo. And then you go up and down the stairs. And every time I see the same words. Nobori, which means to go up. Kudari, to go down. And those are words that I learned like a long time ago, like within one of my first few lessons. But those words never stuck until this time around because I see them every single day. It's part of my daily routine to see these words. And this is where the environment helps a lot. Like being in Tokyo, okay, I worked really hard on my Japanese while I was stuck in Taiwan. But this time, in Tokyo, 1 month, I've progressed exponentially just because I'm here in the environment. I go out, I'm taking my time to read all the katakana, all the hiragana, all the kanji and everything. I ask questions, I talk to people. I'm bathing in the language. So this whole immersion in this environment thing can help a lot. Let's say you're in a city with a very vibrant bebop scene. One day you're probably gonna hear something like this. Because it's a very typical bebop phrase. Someone's bound to play it, and then you'll hear it all the time, and then you'll just be in your ear. This is actually not something that I transcribe. It's something that I heard so many times, and one day I just grab my instrument and I reproduce it because I heard it so much in my ear. Really good jazz musician in Taiwan, probably the only one. No, not the only one, there are a few, but he said there are a lot of old school jazz players who learned from the streets who would probably fail certain jazz exams because they don't even know their scales or arpeggios that well. But man, do they know tons of songs and can improvise over them so well. And then you have people who can pass these exams but can't play jazz to save their life. So something to think about. The past few years, I've worked a lot more on just acquiring Japanese than anything else. And especially during the pandemic, that's really all I was doing. I was playing, but not really practicing music so much. But despite all that, I still managed to expand my jazz vocabulary, my knowledge of songs. And why is that? It is because I developed this nuanced way of listening to music. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't practice. You should. Don't get me wrong. You should practice. You need to practice. But once you reach a certain point and you've acquired a certain level of this nuanced hearing, you don't really need your instrument anymore to be acquiring vocabulary or learning songs. And this is something that is very, very achievable because I've worked with some people. I gave you the example of these two guys, Zach and Will Dickerson. I remember when I first started working with Will Dickerson, he couldn't memorize a simple song to save his life. But now I can show him just about any song, at least in the Gypsy jazz repertoire, and he can already guess where the chords are going, or I just play for him once or twice and okay, ready to go. No need to explain, oh, it's a 1 6 2 5 and this and that. You just play and he'll get it. And why is that? It's because I taught him how to listen to chords, to how, well, it wasn't very complicated. We learned a bunch of songs and we played them every day. And at one point, like I said earlier, you start to hear the chords in your head. So I didn't really teach him how to hear songs. I just made him learn a whole bunch of songs and we played them all the time. When you do this work, it's really amazing because learning becomes easier and easier. Now, I know what some of you haters might be thinking. You're thinking, okay, Dennis, if you know how to practice, why aren't you one of the best in the world? Well, here's the thing. As I said earlier, of course, I'm very passionate about music, but there are certain things, there are other things that interest me in life nowadays. And even in music, I'm not interested in being like a monster soloist or anything like that. As long as I'm decent enough and I'm competent enough, I'm happy. What I'm mostly interested in is musicality, like when we're playing with a band, that playing in such a way that everyone is playing in a musical way, that we're grooving together, we're listening to each other, we're listening to each other's nuances. That for me gives me the greatest satisfaction. Being a soloist for me is just something for fun. It's just a hobby. Because of course, like I said, it's not enough to know how to practice. You also have to put in the work. And I do actually practice, but not as hard or not as much as I used to when I was younger. Unfortunately, in those days, I didn't know how to practice. I'm quite content with the way things are. Like I said, it's a spectrum. You know how to practice, and then you choose how much effort you're willing to put into it. But all this to say that despite not practicing much, I still managed to improve a lot every year. And not to show up, but people have noticed, like, wow, Dennis, have you been practicing? Actually, I haven't really been practicing, but I've been listening to a lot of music. I've been thinking a lot. I also go through phases. Maybe, like, who knows? Maybe I'll feel like practicing some more at some point in my life. Who knows? But right now, my main focus is working on Japanese. What about you guys? What are your goals, and what are you going to do to achieve them? And I mentioned that I'm mostly interested in accompaniment, so I'm lucky that I get to accompany all these great players on the guitar and on the bass. But accompaniment is such a huge thing. When I say accompaniment, the one thing I'm mainly confident about is my ability to learn songs very, very quickly. And then this kind of rhythm, this swing rhythm. But there are so many other rhythms, and that's where other people have different specialties, because there are these like rhythms like I'm playing without a pick because the walls are very thin here and it's kind of late at night. So things like that, okay, I can do adequately, but there are other players who really specialize in that. And remember, there's also this rhythm. This Laurier rhythm. The Laurier family is a family in the east of France. They invented this rhythm. So this is what is called the Laurier Rhythm. It is developed by the Laurier family. It's a gypsy family in the east of France. They showed me how to do it. I practiced it, a little bit, but I'm not confident at using it. Why is that? It's because I have no opportunity to use this rhythm, whereas they've been doing this rhythm their whole lives, and they play the kind of music that uses that rhythm. And I remember talking to Sandro Laurier, one of the players from this family, who was telling me, if we play together, we could play some of these songs, And unfortunately, we don't live close to each other. But if I got to accompany Sandro, I would obviously be able to use this rhythm. I'm sure I get pretty decent at it. But that is not the case, and therefore I'm not very confident at using this rhythm. But this has been part of my life, my career for over 20 years, and I've been using it almost every day for that long. That's how I got confident at it. And this is exactly what I mean when I say this natural lifestyle. If there's a need for it, then you can develop it very easily. There is no need for me to do this, and therefore while I can do it, I'm not confident at it. Now, going back to my friend Brian, as a jazz musician, if you want to be that person where people won't go, oh dear, here comes Brian. Well, guess what? It's not so difficult to achieve. You can definitely reach a decent level, a competent level, and you can even get good. What do you got to do? You got to know the tunes. You got to play them with good time, good tone, and with enough confidence, and that's it. Within 2-3 years of relatively serious daily practice, and definitely lots of thinking, and of course nuanced hearing, then it is very, very achievable. That versus practicing the same routine but practicing it incorrectly for 40 years and not showing any signs of progress, which one are you going to choose? Here's the thing, that if you practice, you put in effort, at one point, well, it depends again on your goals, but at one point, if you have the fundamentals, you don't really have to practice so much anymore. Like, I know that Stokolo Rosenberg doesn't practice really much anymore. Like he did all his practicing when he was much younger, and he reached that level where it's not necessary to be practicing that much anymore. And he's very content with his level, which is very high. It doesn't take long to get decent or good. Prodigies become very incredible within 5 years. That's much less than 10,000 hours of practice. Now, a lot of prodigies, it's true, they do spend almost all day practicing, but we're not here to reach that level of, is that a word? Incredibleness? That level of virtuosity. We're content with being decent. You don't have to sacrifice your entire life to be decent. I myself didn't have to sacrifice my entire life to be relatively fit. Everyone can be decent, even good, within 3 years of regular and efficient practice. It doesn't even have to be practicing 5-6 hours a day. Okay, it is true that if you can put more time into efficient practicing, then you'll get results faster. But what's more important is the efficiency. And as long as you do it fairly regularly, and more important, that you adopt a lifestyle where just living your life equals practicing, then it's very achievable. Earlier, I gave you examples of this natural lifestyle where it equals practicing, but also it happens in the mind. I actually learned the entire fretboard not by practicing scales or anything, but when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time just thinking about the notes on the fretboard. Like, this is G, this is A, this is B, this is, I don't know, this is D, blah blah blah. I did so much of that when I was a kid that at one point I just knew the entire fretboard, all the notes pretty well. Or sometimes I'd be driving or on the bus, listening to music and listening to the bass lines and then analyzing in my head, all right, what chord is that? All right, this is the one chord, oh, it goes to the 6, it goes to the 2, it goes blah blah blah. So it's also possible to practice in here. And this is something that I've been doing for such a long time. I'm often always practicing in my head. Now let's sum things up. Being able to play well comes down to having very specific goals, being able to develop natural habits to achieve those goals, developing your ears to hear what needs to be improved, or finding someone to give you feedback to help you develop your ears to hear what needs to be changed. For example, with Brian, I remember I heard him practicing because he was my roommate for a while. And I heard him practicing, and he was practicing solos. And I went and knocked on his door and said, hey, Brian, you asked me for advice, I gave you advice, and I hear you practicing soloing. No one cares about bass players soloing. If you're going to want to impress people at jam sessions, you want to impress them by knowing the tunes really well, by being able to play a solid bass line in time and a clear bass line. And what did I say? Did I say knowing the songs? Yeah, knowing the songs. That's it. If you go to a jam session and people ask, do you know Autumn Leaves? And you have to pull out the book, that's not going to impress people. But if they say, do you know Autumn Leaves? Yep, let's go. What key? F minor. All right, let's go. Stella by Stella? No problem. Green Dolphin Street? What key? That's going to impress people. Let me correct myself. It's going to impress good musicians. Because bad musicians or people who don't know how to listen, they get impressed by anything. Anyway, I told that to Brian quite directly. And then I heard him practicing what I told him to practice. And I haven't seen him in a few months now, but I know he's getting better and better. So good job, Brian. And I remember Brian did tell me one thing, that he's afraid that people will not like his playing because it's too simple. If he just plays simple walking bass lines and things like that. Well, I guarantee you, okay, maybe bad musicians will not like your playing, but forget bad musicians. I'm talking about really good musicians. If you really want to impress really good musicians, and I know good musicians, I know a lot of them. If you ask Peter Bernstein, do you know Dennis Chang? He will say yes. If you ask Tommy Emmanuel, do you know Dennis Chang? He'll say yes. Martin Taylor, yes. They all know who I am. We all know each other. I'm not saying this to show off or name drop, but these are people that I've hung out with. I can't say I'm friends with everyone, where we've worked together in the past, we played together, but these are people that there's no degree of separation. These are people that I can access directly. I know what impresses these people. It's the ability to play musically, and it's the ability to play musically is not so complex. Play simple, play it in time, play it in tune. That's it. You don't have to be doing all these fancy things, these polyrhythms and whatever. What I've noticed, this is just something that a lot of jazz drummers don't understand. I meet a lot of players at jam sessions all over the place who have a lot of dexterity, but no sense of musicality. Okay, yes, I know musicality is subjective, but they have a lot of drummers, or not just drummers, a lot of musicians have this idea that they're being hip by doing all these complex things. And at worst, they do it, but they don't do it well, meaning that they're doing all these fancy rhythms and whatever, but it's not even in time. And then they're playing too loud. These are people who never got to work with the level of musicians that I had the opportunity to work with. And therefore no one ever taught them how unmusical they were. And this to me is the difference between a good musician and maybe a good instrumentalist. A good instrumentalist may have a lot of technique, may even be able to play very, very well, but musicality has to do with the general overall, the overall mood, how you play with musicians. For example, let's say you're playing in time, but you're playing fills all over the place while the sax player is doing their solo, and they're playing too loud, then you're a bad musician. And it's very funny because I meet so many of these players. They think they're being really, really hip when they do that. They have no idea. There's a reason why, if you listen to a lot of recordings, accompanists play relatively simple. There's a reason for that. I think a lot of these players who are doing all these things, they're thinking to themselves, man, I can't believe all these old legends didn't think of doing what I'm doing, man. I'm inventing something new. It's a whole new style. No, there's a reason why I didn't do that, because it sucks. Okay, now it's true that there are certain bands there that are playing super, super high level complex music. These musicians are the exception, not the norm, and they're purposely doing this, and they do it very, very well. But these are also players that probably know they're not going to be playing with most players. They probably have their own band or just a select few musicians like-minded where they play that music with. Now here's the question. Do you really think you're at that level? Maybe you do. But if not, maybe don't do that at jam sessions. This is exactly what I mean by ego and Dunning-Kruger. You can be very intelligent, very talented. I know a lot of people far more talented than me, but unless they change, which is, I think, unlikely, they will never surpass me because they're too proud and or they don't hear these nuances. Like I said, I know from experience to only give feedback on two very specific occasions, when people directly ask me, and I can also tell that they're being very sincere, because some people do ask me, how do I sound? But I know they're actually fishing for compliments. And in this case, I just say, oh, you sound great, beautiful. It's really how they word things. More often than not, especially with all the experience that I have, all the people that I've met, I can tell who's being sincere or not. The other occasion is where I would give feedback is if I'm working on a very serious project and I'm in a position of leadership. That's the only thing, that these days I'm usually not the leader. And when I'm the leader and we're trying to present a very serious project, and that's really where I'm going to say what I have to say. Usually if I'm the leader, I get to choose the musicians. I'm usually going to choose musicians who can handle this. And it's very interesting. I've been in projects in the past where some musicians said I was too harsh, unreasonable, too strict. And then the other musicians in the band, they said, what? I have absolutely no problems working with Dennis. He's like the most easygoing guy ever. How is that? Because the people who complain about me couldn't do what they were asked to do, and they weren't going to change, and it was a constant struggle. The people who said I was the most easygoing person, the most laid-back person, these are people that did their homework. I didn't have to say anything to them. I understand my Japanese teacher when she said that she didn't want to discourage students by constantly correcting them. And with age and experience, I agree. I know it's better to keep the truth to yourself unless people sincerely want to hear it. And that's what I mean when I say the biggest obstacle you're likely to encounter is you yourself. Food for thought. Are you pissed off at me yet? I chose a very difficult path of always being willing to hear criticism. And I tell you that I know it's not easy. It can get depressing and brutal sometimes. I know that. But here's the thing, without this, without all that, I don't think I could have become friends with a lot of musicians that I admired greatly. Some of them message me from time to time, say, hey, how are you doing? We should play again sometime. It was fun last time. And that makes me so incredibly happy. And I remember one time Birelli just called me out of the blue one day, just like that, and say, hey, how's it going? I had fun last time. It would be cool again if we could play together again. Maybe we can find some gigs in North America or something. That made me so, so, so happy. Considering that in the beginning I didn't do such a good job accompanying him. But he was very nice to me and he told me certain things. It was not easy. I didn't do a good job in the beginning despite having all this experience because it was our first time playing together, and with Birelli, there's no rehearsal. You don't know what you're going to play. You just have to know it. And you have to know the arrangement. If you don't know it, well, you better be able to guess what it's going to be. That's was very stressful, but we did a number of gigs together. Towards the end, it got a whole lot better. Now, here's the thing. To solo at the level of Birelli Legrand, from a statistical and realistic point of view, is probably beyond the reach of the vast majority of people. But to be able to play with him as an accompanist and to be able to play with him in such a way that he will be satisfied with you, this is within the reach of most moderately talented people out there. Definitely will require some level of work, the kind of work that I went through, but certainly nowhere near the amount of work required to play at his level. I have set the bar so that I can play with my favorite players, not as a soloist, but as an accompanist. If your dream is to play drums or bass for X or Y musician, there's a chance you can achieve that, and you don't have to necessarily worry about playing the most crazy thing, complicated thing. You just have to be able to do the job and do it well. Most of the time, the job does not involve having to play all these crazy polyrhythms. You just have to groove. I'm pretty sure that even Brian could reach a level where if he were to jam with Peter Bernstein, Peter at the end would say, sounded great. And he'd probably be sincere about it. But a lot of bass players, a lot of drummers, pianists, they will never get hired unless they get hired through political channels because their Dunning-Kruger level doesn't allow them to compute the fact that they're not only overdoing it, but they're doing it very poorly. And it's actually the same thing with Gypsy Jazz for me in the beginning. I did go through that phase. I remember in the beginning, I was playing rhythm. I was doing all these all these little stupid things. And I thought I was being so cool. I was like, wow, I can't believe all these legendary players didn't think of doing what I'm doing right now. And then no one told me that it sucked, but I came to realize it myself that it was really, really bad. I came to really understand why it sounded bad. I could hear it. I've had a lot of deep philosophical conversations about such things with Birelli Legrand and Sylvain Luc about being able to hear things that other people can't hear and having to shut your mouth. I meet a lot of people tell me, oh, I love Gypsy Jazz. I'm like, great, wonderful. And here's the thing. I'm not trying to be mean, but a lot of people ask me for lessons. And often one of the things I don't like teaching privately because a lot of people don't know what they want. And if they don't know what they want, deep down in me, I feel really, really bad. Like that they'd be wasting their time with me because I have a lot of information that I could share with them, but unless they know very clearly what they're trying to do, if I feel like just me giving a list of things to practice is a little bit of waste of time unless they really like it. Think about it. You have these teachers who say, oh, these kids were my students. Look how good they are. Now, maybe a teacher may have 3 or 4 star students, but what about the others? Why don't they talk about the others? Now, there would be one thing if every single student was at that level, but that's rarely the case, isn't it? Is it because the teaching is bad? Probably not. Probably he's a good teacher. but it's also often the student themselves are not into it as much as the star students. And if I can say something, there are lots of very talented but overconfident people, and that's not a good thing. Now, there are some people maybe not as talented but also severely lacking in confidence. That's also not a good thing. But to be honest, I can do a whole lot more with people that are lacking in confidence than people with a lot of confidence. With people with a lot of confidence, it is very, very, very difficult to bring down their level of humility. Whereas people who are lacking confidence, it's much easier to help them boost their level of confidence. Being confident is very important, but it needs to match our real level. If our level of confidence is far greater than our ability, then that's usually Dunning-Kruger, and that's very hard to bring down. If, on the other hand, our level of confidence is far below our actual level, let me tell you, it's very easy for me as a teacher to bring it back up to where it belongs. How good you want to get is something you have to set for yourself. I gave you the example of my father, who at a fairly late age managed to learn French. Not only did he learn French, he immersed himself in that culture to such a high degree that he reached maybe a native level or near native level. And he even got a job teaching French at the university level. Charles Limburger, the famous violinist guitarist, he claims that his level of Hungarian is also at the native level. And he started to learn that language very late in life as well. Because he did exactly like my father, a very, very, very deep immersion into the language and culture. I can only hope that I can bring my Japanese level to somewhere near that. I don't know if it will happen. We'll see. But I'm definitely working on it. How we define native can get very complex too, because some people reach a high degree of fluency, but they retain their home country's accent. I know a lot of English speakers who speak at an extremely, extremely high level, but they have their slight accent from wherever they came from. But such people speak better English, French, or whatever than native people who make tons of mistakes. And then there are people who are native at their language, but so very uneducated that they butcher their own mother tongue. So that's something to think about as well. I remember my dad when I was a kid. I remember he was practicing like his accent, like certain sounds, just be able to produce the French accent. He was always repeating words very slowly. That's one of the memories I have of my father. And that's what I do with the guitar as well, with music. If there's something I want to do, I hear the sound in my ear and I work on it to be able to achieve that sound. I work on it slowly, then I speed things up, blah, blah, blah. So you have to be able to hear it, and then after you have to find the method to be able to reproduce it. This is a level of obsession that maybe doesn't interest everyone. I totally get that. I do the same thing with the Japanese. Earlier when I went to McDonald's, I noticed I mispronounced certain things. And actually, before going to McDonald's earlier, what I didn't tell you is that I actually practiced this every day, even for months, the same sentence. And there's still work to do because it's about creating muscle memory in our mouths to be able to produce the right sounds. For example, the word Japanese in Japanese is Nihongo, but I used to say Nihongo, which is the wrong pronunciation. So I would practice Nihongo, Nihongo. Again, this is taking things to the extreme, but you set your own goals. I hope this gives you a lot to think about, gives you ideas, hopefully maybe even inspires you. But one final thing that I want to say is this, that I can hear a lot of things, especially the things that I specialize in, but you would think that I'm a very judgmental person, which is not true at all. I don't listen to people with any kind of judgmental view whatsoever. Unless of course I'm playing with them. If I'm on stage and I'm playing with a really bad drummer, I get really pissed off in my head, but I don't say anything. But otherwise, for the most part, I play music just for fun. And as long as people can play decently enough, I'm very happy. Let's say I play with a drummer that keeps it relatively simple. Um, they know their level, therefore they have no ego. And okay, maybe here and there they slow down or speed up. I don't care. I'm very happy to play with them again. If trad jazz rhythm sections don't sound like the real deal, but can more or less play in time, then it's already quite a good thing in my opinion. I only become very, very critical if it's a serious project. And usually these days, I tend to do projects with players who are better than me. So I'm usually the weakest link. This was a very long video. It took a lot of hours to prepare, and hopefully I conveyed my thoughts well enough. Despite even making notes, it was still very hard to talk about this. Maybe leave a comment. I'd love to hear your stories, your point of view.